The year is 1969, and North Korea has long been a thorn in the U.S.'s side. Backed up by the Soviet Union, North Korea's aggression toward the South is kept in check only by a very tight leash held by the Kremlin and the threat of American military response. However, the North Koreans chafe against the presence of Americans on the peninsula, the only roadblock in their quest to unite the two nations by force. In order to keep tabs on the communist bloc nations, the United States operates a reconnaissance program known as Beggar Shadow. The program uses spy aircraft flying safely over international waters and well away from the airspace of the nations they're monitoring. Yet, their powerful radars and eavesdropping technologies allow them to pick up communications between military units deep inside the hostile territory. At 7 a.m. on Tuesday, the 15th of April, 1969, an American EC-121M with the call sign Deep Sea 129 took off from Naval Air Station Atsugi in Japan and made for the Korean coast. Aboard it were 8 officers and 23 enlisted men, and their task was routine by now: loiter near the Korean coast and eavesdrop on North Korean communications. The flight route would take it within 50 miles of the Korean coast, where it would fly a racetrack-like route that would take it north near the Soviet Union's coast before turning back for Asan Air Base in South Korea. Rated as minimal risk, the mission had been carried out for 2 years without incident, and in the first 3 months of 1969, almost 200 similar missions had already been flown by the U.S. Navy and Air Force. This day, however, was different, and at 12:34 local time, 6 hours into the mission, radars in South Korea detected the takeoff of 2 North Korean MiG-21s. Assuming that they were responding to Deep Sea 129, the planes were tracked and the spy plane was warned. But being safely over international waters, it wasn't believed the plane was in danger. Then, suddenly, an hour after they took off, the jets made for Deep Sea 129 at what was clearly closing speed, and the American plane was warned. Deep Sea 129 immediately aborted its mission and returned to base, but the surprised North Korean jets quickly caught up with it. On radar, American operators watched as the 2 radar tracks merged, and then Deep Sea 129's track disappeared. Initially, none of the agencies involved were concerned, as protocol dictated that deep sea descend below radar coverage if threatened by hostile aircraft. Though these early model MiG-21s did not carry onboard radar, conditions allowed the MiG pilots to visually spot Deep Sea 129. Soon it became clear the North Koreans had downed the plane with an air-to-air missile. Immediately after the attack, North Korean military forces went into high readiness. Back in Washington, President Nixon and his staff received news of the attack. Nixon was furious, but more than that, he was drunk too. Aides had described Nixon as having developed bouts of insomnia and as having taken to drinking. He had begun to display extreme bouts of aggression, further fueled by his growing reliance on alcohol. And when he got the call that night that the North Koreans had downed an American plane flying over international waters, Nixon's anger grew to apocalyptic levels. 31 Americans were dead, and Nixon immediately got on the phone with the Joint Chiefs of Staff and ordered them to produce a list of targets for tactical nuclear strike. American nuclear bombers immediately went on standby as the Joint Chiefs drew up a list of recommendations for nuclear strikes deep inside North Korea. Within an hour, a list of targets were drawn up and sent to Henry Kissinger, Nixon's national security advisor, as American planes prepared to carry out what might be the opening shots of World War III. The targets listed gave Nixon 2 options: a series of attacks to serve as a punitive action against North Korea, or a full-blown nuclear attack that would crush the regime and prevent a large-scale war, mostly by leaving little of North Korea behind. The first list included 12 targets ranging from command centers to airfields and naval bases, and incredibly, despite the use of 12 10-kiloton nuclear weapons, would produce casualties as few as 100 to a few thousand. The second list, however, included the use of 70-kiloton nuclear weapons to destroy all of North Korea's major airfields as well as its command and control centers. Casualties would be in the tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands, though the vast majority of them would be military personnel. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were highly alarmed by Nixon's demand for a nuclear retaliation, as was Kissinger. If forced to carry out the attack, as Nixon had every legal right to do, the military warned that if they were going to strike with nuclear weapons, then they had best go all out and avoid the possibility of North Korea putting up much of a retaliation against forces in the South. This, of course, would immediately launch a war on the peninsula, but it was thought that North Korean forces would be so devastated they'd be able to offer little resistance. Launching on the first list of targets with the smaller-scale tactical nukes would only provoke North Korea into full-scale war, and with most of its forces intact. Yet, while North Korea could be utterly devastated in a surprise nuclear attack, the fallout, political and not just radiological, would be catastrophic for the United States. For the second time in history, the US would launch a nuclear attack as an offensive measure, and this time it would utterly devastate an entire country in a surprise attack, a nuclear Pearl Harbor. This would completely destabilize relations with the Soviet Union and China both, and possibly prompt a nuclear response from the Russians. Even if there was no nuclear response from the Soviet Union, it would prove to the Soviets that a trigger-happy madman was in charge of things in the White House, and that nuclear war could be one drink away. This would make the careful system of checks and balances between the US and the Soviet Union that had so far averted nuclear conflict fall completely apart. Thankfully, Henry Kissinger postponed presenting the attack options to President Nixon until he had sobered up in the morning, by which time the prospect of launching a full-scale nuclear war seemed like a much less attractive option. Instead, the United States sent a task force led by the aircraft carriers Enterprise, Ticonderoga, Ranger, and Hornet to patrol off Korean waters and ensure the safety of all aircraft flying in the region. This would be the largest concentration of firepower in the region since the Korean War. For their part, the Soviet Union immediately dispatched 2 destroyers upon hearing of the downing of Deep Sea 129 in an effort to attempt to locate any surviving crew members and rescue them, or at the very least to secure the remains of the American airmen. The act was not just one of solidarity between the two Cold War rivals, but also meant to signal to Pyongyang how deeply displeased Moscow was with the shooting down of Deep Sea 129. What do you think would have happened if Nixon had launched a nuclear strike against North Korea? Is it too easy for an off-the-rails president to launch a nuclear attack? Let us know in the comments, and as always, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more great content.